All right, looks like we're recording. And guys, I'm so excited to have on the program Melanie Kaplan. And Melanie, I just finished your book within the last hour. I have been I've been doing this thing when I do interviews that I can sense there's going to be like there's quite an emotional buildup with this book, and I wanted it fresh, so I timed it that I would finish the book right now, and it stayed with me. It's very impactful. I don't want to spoil the ending or anything like that, but this is a very powerful book. I just want to, well, first let me just welcome you and welcome you to the program.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's really nice to be here, and I'm glad you read the book. And it's just whenever I hear that someone has read it, it just I feel something because this was like, as you know, my heart and soul went into that, and spent so much of my life working on it. And it's just so nice to be able to share this story now and have people actually reading it. So thank
Yeah,
you.
well, I want to say too, read this book. This is an incredible achievement. I was not expecting this to be so exhaustive. Um,
Mhm.
you left no stone unturned. So just to give people sort of like a little bit of a summary of what the book is, it's basically like an adventure with you and Hammy, your dog here on the cover, going to basically try to discover like where Hammy came from and what was done to him. Hammy was a lab dog, as the book implies, and but it really becomes like this adventure story between you and Hammy. That's really touching and moving. Your love for Hammy is so profound. Maybe we should just start with Hammy, since that's what this book is so much about. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about Hammy.
Well, I did not love Hammy at first, and I was sure he was going to just be a foster, but I had heard that this group of beagles had gotten out of a lab, and I was very curious about it, and I really didn't know anything about dogs being in labs. And so I thought, oh, I'll foster this dog and learn something about it and introduce him to people, and end of story. And of course, that was just the beginning of the story, because a month after that, I adopted him. And he was so scared when I brought him home, and he was not afraid of humans, which I was really relieved about. I just didn't know, if he'd spent time in a lab, I thought, well, he could be just totally scared of people and want nothing to do with me. And so he wanted my attention, and he wanted food, but he did not want to leave his bed. He didn't want to walk around the neighborhood. He trembled all the time. And it took a really long time to get into a normal routine with him and have him go to new places where he wasn't terrified. And so it took a lot of patience on my part. And it was just incredibly rewarding to see him become more confident, and then kind of go out in the world as this ambassador of all the dogs that have been in medical research.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary to learn about that aspect because there's a lot of animal rights activists. We're trying to get the beagles out, but where you start is with the adoption process and in taking, care of Hammy, which is sort of like it's almost like for some activists, myself included, it's almost like we kind of get this sense like the job's done, beagles are free, but there's this whole
Mhm.
other aspect of care for these beagles, and you really take us into that world, starting with this DC7, this group of beagles that were fostered out through the Beagle Freedom Project. And tell me a little bit about that, because you were like you've seemed to have clearly gotten into like animal rights and that sort of thing, but at the start you really weren't in that world. You were just you were like learning in real time. That's kind of what I love about this book, is it's kind of like your journey of experiencing and learning about this world.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. I think because I didn't know anything, I was just taking in all this information that I got from the Beagle Freedom Project about what dogs were used for, and how many dogs were in labs, and how long this has been going on, and how it's really not that effective in terms of drug testing. And I didn't look at this as a research project at the time. I was really just taking it in and repeating it. And after some time of introducing Hammy to all these people and them saying, oh my gosh, I had no idea that dog testing still happens. And is this legal? Then I really switched gears because, I've never called myself an animal activist, but certainly I was fundraising for the group. I was passing out flyers. I was just repeating these things that I had been told, and had this idea in my mind that we got to get the beagles out, whatever we do. And that was just my kind of uninformed stance. And then when I switched gears and put my journalist hat on, I really started digging in and understood, of course, that I have to learn the whole story. I mean, I can't just tell one organization's story, because that's not right. Just like if I were to only listen to the researchers, that wouldn't be right either. And it's really this complex, nuanced, I think just telling it through these different voices gives kind of this technicolor view of what's actually happening. It's not black and white in my mind. And so when I opened up to that, I kind of pulled back from, supporting this organization or that organization, and knew to a certain extent I had to stay neutral as much as I could, even though Hammy, I went into it with a big Hammy bias.
Yeah. But speaking as someone from the journalistic world, I know there's going to be a ton of people from that world who disagree with me on this. And I talk about this sometimes, but during my career, I started to feel more like an activist than I did a journalist. And I realized that made me inappropriate in times for the job, but I think it made me a better journalist, because I actually cared about the subject. And I've seen a lot of people throughout the years in journalism who are sort of going through the motions, and they don't actually feel much from the stories that they're reporting on. So anyway, that's a diversion, but this really is a journalistic endeavor. Like I said, it's incredible how many people you spoke to, how many places you visited. This is like a lengthy road trip that you took with Hammy, all these different places. And as you mentioned, you're not just talking to animal activists, you're talking to vivisectors themselves, you're talking to people who advocate for that. And so you're getting the full picture, and not just, as you mentioned, not just the words of Beagle Freedom Project, which I know you came to realize maybe not everything that I heard was exactly accurate pertaining to Hammy, because there's a lot of different situations for these beagles. But let's start with the Beagle Freedom Project, because it was extraordinary for me to read the name Kevin Jonas. Early on in your book, you mentioned Kevin as basically being the person you were in contact with, I guess, initially, in terms of meeting up with Hammy. And as people may know, Kevin is like a legend of the movement, one of the basically the leader of the Shack campaign. Did all this prison time, and I actually didn't know this about Kevin, that he was doing this at that time, doing the Beagle Freedom Project. So I started to learn more about his post Shack work, and that was kind of cool. But tell me a little bit about that beginning phase when you guys were just sort of initially communicating.
Well, yeah, I knew nothing of anything. I just signed up as a volunteer, and I really did keep bugging Kevin because he was in Minnesota. The Beagle Freedom Project is based in California. I was in DC, and I just knew that there were beagles. They got out sometimes. They needed foster families. I'm like, I'm in. And I kept emailing him every so often. And eventually he said, it was just before July 4th. And he said, I think we've got a rescue coming up in Virginia. And we never know if these are going to happen, because sometimes the lab backs out at the 11th hour, but just kind of hold that date. And can you be available? And can we use your backyard for these dogs to come? And I said, not really, because it's super tiny. I live in the city. And so this meeting place was set up in Potomac, Maryland, and the dogs did get out that day, and we kind of all met there. It was me and 6 other foster families. And it was just this kind of magical day. When I think back now, the 7 dogs arrived in a van, and they were all let out in the backyard, and we just watched them for a few hours, and you could see their personalities start to emerge, because one was kind of running around the perimeter trying to escape, and one was kind of off in some trees and really didn't want to be approached. And the first thing I noticed about the dog who would become Hammy is that when somebody opened up a treat bag, he was like zipping over there. So because I didn't think I was going to adopt him, I kind of let people gravitate toward the dogs that they liked. And I waited till the end. And then there were two dogs left. And I'm like, all right, I guess I'm going to take this one.
Yeah, and you sort of battled against falling in love with Hammy. You kind of you were like, no, I don't need this, because you were someone who liked to travel around a lot, and it was almost like I remember this scene where you described to talking to Hammy and saying, "Okay, but we're going to be on the road a lot," and then you say that Hammy ended up coming to love the road trips and everything. He loved it. Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
yeah. He really did. I was doing a lot of travel writing before the pandemic, for the Washington Post, and he would hop in the car and we set off everywhere. We drove cross country several times, but at the beginning he was so nervous, and so every time we went, it was kind of pushing him outside his comfort zone just a little bit more. And yeah, eventually I think he was at the point where we'd come back from like an 8-week road trip and he'd settle in, and like 2 days later he was ready to go again. I was like, hold on.
mhm, mhm.
So
Well,
I think he did enjoy it.
you mentioned writing for the Washington Post. Give listeners a bit of your backstory, like before all this, because like I mentioned, this is sort of like a journalistic achievement, I would say, and so your background leads to that, your writing and everything. But tell us a little bit about your background.
So I've been freelancing for more than 20 years, and I started off writing for free and writing for trade magazines. I remember there was one magazine, it was called Packaging Machinery Technology. So it was all about the machines that put the toothpaste in the tubes and the applesauce in the pouches. There's a whole
Hmm.
magazine for that. So, and then, I've stuck with freelancing long enough that I've really been able to choose a little bit more what I want to write about. And travel has always been so much fun for me. Didn't pay well, so I've kind of done a little balancing the things that don't pay well, but they're a lot of fun, and then the things that aren't so fun, but they pay great. But my work's really been a mix of travel and science and writing about animals. I did a celebrity pet column for WebMD for many years and a pets column for Washingtonian magazine. And I was probably doing more and more science as my career progressed. And I like it. I think as a journalist, I mean, this, you kind of head into a brand new topic and you don't know anything about it, and it's a crash course and you learn everything, and then all of a sudden you're an expert for a few minutes, and then you move on to the next topic. And
Hmm.
so even though I don't have any kind of science background, I would take on each of these topics like it was a little mini course, and I love the learning. And this book was not so mini, but kind of just a bigger version of that, where I just had quite a bit to learn to understand even what I wanted to write.
Right. Yeah. 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 It's like journalism is a great job for someone who can't figure out what they like, because you get to explore like whatever you're into at the time. Um, so yeah, so like that kind of reminded me when you were describing the machines, it kind of reminded me of this scene in the book where you visited this place that was doing organ on a chip, because the
Mhm.
organ on a chip thing was something that I had just heard about conceptually, but you actually went there and started messing around with the stuff. They were showing you how to do this stuff, and so you actually gave me a more specific understanding of what it is, what it looks like. And that's one of the things I liked, is like each chapter you kind of like, you talked about the problem, you started to talk about what are possible solutions that scientists are working towards, that sort of thing. And you really took us there. You went to all these places and looked at it. But tell me a little bit about some of those ways that we can get past animal testing, that scientists are looking at, and are they currently viable? I know some people say maybe we're not quite there yet. What did you come to learn?
Well, there's so much happening, and even since the book came out, there's new things. I think there's a drug that's being produced or developed right now that hasn't used any animals at all, which is super exciting. But the organ chip that you mentioned, it's this little device. I actually have one on my bookshelf that they gave me.
Nice.
It's like this big, and it bends and it moves, and it can, if you plug it in, it can kind of do a breathing motion. So you put human organ cells in there. So you put liver cells or kidney cells, and then you put the drugs in or the bacteria, and you see how those human cells react. So you're not dealing with mouse cells or beagle cells, and it's pretty cool. So there's a lot of different organ chips that are being used, and all the major pharmaceutical companies are using those. The FDA is using it, and yet even the makers of these chips will say we are still not ready to move 100% away from animals.
Hmm.
There are so many other things. There's AI, there's computer modeling, there's human data, there's organoids. And from what I understand, it's really a combination of a lot of these things. It's not saying, okay, take out the dogs, put in the organ chips. It's doing a lot of these non-animal methods, and really learning a more human relevant way of gathering this information. And I think, the other just really important thing to understand, it's basic, but I find that it's helpful to remember, we're not looking to replace the dog with some of these alternatives that act like the dog does, because we're
Mhm.
not doing all this for beagle health. I mean, we're doing it mostly for human health. Certainly there's veterinary research, but really this is all human biomedical medicine. And so we're not replacing those animals. We're finding like a new and improved and better way to learn for human health, really.
Yeah, I have been doing a lot of Beagle related stuff lately because of the advances with Ridgeland and that sort of thing. And I'll just quickly note that Beagles are primarily used, from what everybody tells me, because they're nice animals, docile, forgiving, and the right size. Um, and but they're also, I mean, in my view and many people's view, they're not really that relevant to humans. I mean, you can just think about like chocolate. You can't give blueberries, I don't think, to a dog, or onion. I think all these different foods where you're not supposed to give certain foods to a dog because their physiology is different than ours. So, in my view, it's like it's setting us back to even research, like delaying these drugs from coming to the market. I want to bring up, this is an extraordinary quote that you have in your book. This guy, Neil Wilcox from the FDA, he
Mm.
asked, what if we find out drugs are already toxic to humans? And his concern was the reputation to the toxicologists. That was an extraordinary quote you got. I don't know. I don't know if that was something he said to you or something he said to, that you picked up along the way, but maybe just what were you thinking when you heard something like that? Because I think that kind of encapsulates um, some of our selfishness as humans a little bit.
Yeah, Neil said that to me, and he'd been at the FDA for a long time, and the FDA is charged with, keeping these drugs and food and cosmetics and cigarette products safe for Americans. And so it's something that I think they're thinking about all the time. And so they want to be careful that they're not approving a drug. I mean, as you probably know, the drug approval process is just totally rigorous. There's, so much information that has to be submitted. Historically, it's been animal data. That's shifting a little bit. But yeah, I mean, there's been times in history where some drug has been approved or it hasn't been tested thoroughly, and lots of people have died. And so I think from their perspective, it's like, oh my God, like we would be ruined. But of course, we're talking tens of millions of animals whose lives have been taken. And you're right. I mean, it's not that predictive. This 9 out of 10, the statistic that 9 out of 10 drugs that are successful in animals fail in humans is just shocking to me every time I think about it. And so it is delaying the drugs. It's, for people who have rare diseases or their children have rare diseases, if we can be doing this more efficiently, like why are we not, right?
Right. I should have asked this before we started. Can I spoil what you found out as far as where Hammy came from, or would you like people to kind of discover that in the book?
Let's let people read that.
Okay, okay, interesting. So
I
a
mean,
big
what I
part
knew when I adopted him is that he came from a lab in Virginia. So,
of lab in Virginia.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, so um, So, like I said, a big part of this book, the vast majority of it is trying to discover what happened to Hammy, and with also this bigger goal of, explaining animal testing, why we use dogs. Um, and you really go back into this history too. Like I was just amazed how much I didn't know about this reading your book. One of the things that just off the top of my head stood out to me was this statue that you mentioned, this brown
Mm.
dog statue. Something that I was just I was amazed that I didn't know about this statue. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, you're gonna have to remind me the dates of that, the brown dog affair. So it was a couple
Yeah,
Swedish vivisectionists. Was it the early 1900s?
I think so. Well, just off the top, I didn't write it down,
I'm
but
quizzing you.
yeah, I think it
Um,
was like the early 1900s. I think
okay,
is what you
thank you.
said. It's probably more fresh in my mind.
So, yes, a couple women, a couple Swedish vivisectionists went to London and they sat in kind of undercover on a class, a medical school class, and they ended up writing up their notes about this dog that had supposedly been experimented on a few times, and there were, various procedures done to this dog. And then, as was done in the time, the dog was kind of in the middle of the classroom, and people were looking down on this dog strapped to the table, and the dog was, given this one last procedure and then killed. And so this ended up becoming a really big deal. I think that the what was the vivisection society there in England? They ended up writing about it. There was a little book published about it. There was a lawsuit, and this statue of the little brown dog was erected. And the local people were really happy about this statue that was, meant to represent all of the dogs that were lost unnecessarily. But the medical school students came and protested, and there was literally this massive riot, and they ended up having to take the statue down. But then it was re-erected in, I think it was the 80s.
Yeah, I think it was like
And
84 or 85.
yeah, in Battersea Parks, which would be amazing to go see. I have not seen that in person. But
Yeah.
yeah, and the words on it were really just really moving too. It was, kind of about the animals and the men and women who I can't. Do you remember what's?
I don't remember the specific quote, but I was more just struck by how there was this sort of visual representation of how long this struggle has been going on, which almost depresses me. I mean, well, it does depress me. The fact that this has been going on for centuries, and yet we're still where we are when beagles are still being used for animal testing, and we're still using animals for testing and that sort of thing. So,
Yeah. All right, I did just find this. I'm going to read this little last part. So, it was in memory of the little brown terrier dog done to death in the laboratory of University College, after having endured vivisection extending over more than 2 months and having been handed over from one vivisector to another till death came to his release. Also in memory of the 232 dogs vivisected in the same place during the year 1902. Men and women of England, how long shall these things be?
yeah, and here we are now, like 123, I guess, 100 years later, still talking about this. It's
Here we are.
incredible.
I know.
Yeah. Well, another quote, speaking of quotes that stood out to me, you were talking about how all these euphemisms are used. And historically, one of them that I found just extraordinary, they were talking about starving the dogs. You said that they called it prolonged rest of the digestive organ. Like, talk about just an incredible, like, mitigation of your own conscience trying to describe it this way or to avoid, public scrutiny, that sort of thing. Prolonged rests of the digestive organs.
I know.
Um, uh, yeah, this story is extraordinary. Were you like the breadth of it? I've described several times as being kind of amazing to me, just how much is packed in. Did that surprise you when you started going? And did you think that this was going to be a much more simple project that kind of ballooned out into something really massive?
Yeah, yeah, it definitely got massive.
Mhm.
And, I think when I was going into it, I had in my mind, okay, I'll have a chapter on the activists and a chapter on the ethics and a chapter on the alternatives and then maybe a chapter on the history. And as I progressed, I realized that all of these things were part of every chapter. I mean, you look at the FDA and there's a whole history of beagles being kept in the basement of the USDA building, like right off the National Mall, a mile from where I live. And the chemicals, there's a whole history on that. And ethics, of course, are involved in all of these things. You can't just have like one chapter on ethics. So it was, I think one of the biggest challenges is just figuring out what I didn't need to put in there because I could have written 10 books on this topic. It was really overwhelming.
Wow, yeah. So there's a lot that you didn't put in. That's amazing because this is already a big project. Um, yeah. What is it like, living in DC, kind of being in the epicenter of all this and being close to where the federal government is? I guess that gives you a different kind of perspective on what's going on, with the FDA, the EPA, and you go into great lengths discussing, how these organizations are, you know, too slowly, unfortunately, but moving away from animal testing or saying that they want to move away from animal testing. And I think you highlighted that the EPA was moving faster than certain groups like the FDA. But yeah, tell me a little bit about that, your perspective there in DC and how that's informing you.
I don't know that me being here has much of an impact. It certainly didn't get me interviews with the FDA or
Mhm.
EPA. So, I think that just like any big government agency, things move really slowly. And I do know that there are people at all of these organizations who are really, really working hard to do the right thing and move away from animal testing and who are big champions of these non-animal methods or new approach methods. And but you can have a lot of people working for it and fighting for it, but it still is not going to happen overnight. You need policy change and new laws. And I really, throughout my career as a journalist, I have really stayed away from politics. I think I interviewed a politician once, and she was really upset because I asked a question that was like not on the agenda and kind of yelled at me. And so I was like, "Oh, I don't need to do that anymore." But it was a good refresher doing this book because I had to learn, like, what happens to a bill, and because every year you've got these new bills, and I had to remember how the legislative process works and really dive more into government than I had before because I think for the companies, the pesticide makers and the drug makers, they are doing this animal testing in some cases because it's been required. I mean, I talked to this one guy at a major global chemical company that makes pesticides, and he said if the dog requirement for pesticide testing was stopped, like we would stop doing that testing tomorrow. So, the industry can't do it alone. The government moves incredibly slowly. And now we're at an interesting point because the Trump administration is actually talking about this more than other administrations about moving away from animal testing and devoting more resources to the development of these non-animal methods. And, I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. I don't know that there's a real plan in place for it yet, but the fact that it's being talked about, and the NIH and FDA have both come out this year and said that, animal testing is not that effective. We want to move to more effective methods using AI and computer modeling and the organ chips and all these other things. That's encouraging. So I'm optimistic about that.
Yeah, I'm glad that you noted, though, that, there's a difference between action and words, because we have heard these things before, but you're right that we're hearing about it seemingly more. And even groups like White Coat Waste, who, have been pretty effective because of their conservative political tilt at, reaching members of the administration and members of Congress, have pointed out that promises have been broken, even while there have been, advances. But yeah, I mean, it's reason to be optimistic. I don't, this is kind of a broad question that I don't think really anybody can answer, but I'll just ask it, and maybe you've thought about it some, but it's just like, how do we capitalize on this moment as activists? Because the vast majority of my listeners are probably animal activists, highly motivated ones, I would think. And so, how do we capitalize so that this moment doesn't pass us by? Are there things that we can do to speed up this advance?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that, well, let me talk about the book for a second, because when I started this, I read a lot of books that were already out there, because before I could write my proposal and pitch this to an agent, I had to see what was out there and what's the competition. And, there's a lot of books by animal activists, right? And then there's academic books that write about this topic. And there was nothing in between. And so I guess I'd put the question back to you and say, I could say, okay, animal activists, like, you need to just talk more and get the word out more. But what do you find that people are responsive to, people outside of the movement? I mean, I think that really getting this into the public awareness more is really important. That's a big reason I wrote the book, because people just didn't know it was happening. And I wanted to be more, I want it to be more of the conversation. Like, I want the two sides to be coming together and having these dialogues that are really important, because, otherwise they're just on their sides. And I don't know that we're going to be moving forward at all. So, maybe that's part of the answer, is really getting people at the same table and having these dialogues. And, I had this moment of hope recently. I shouldn't say moment of hope, because I do feel really hopeful, but, I was on a radio show, and there was somebody from Humane World for Animals and somebody from Americans for Medical Progress. And I found that what they were saying was not that different. I think everybody wants to move away from animals. They think that there is a future with these NAMs, but how do we get there? What's the transition look like? What do we need to do for animals in the meantime who are in the labs? Because, there might be more than 100 million animals in labs at this very moment, which is just staggering. Mm-hmm. So, maybe more of these dialogues would be something that's helpful. I mean, what do you think?
That was some good jujitsu you just did. Put it back on me, but then you spared me by continuing to talk. So I appreciate that.
I gave you a minute to think.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it just kind of reminded me that, and I'm kind of ashamed to admit this, but I learned about Henry Spira from your book. And Henry Spira is someone who I should have known about before, is like massive figure in the animal rights movement. And you kind of know that Henry Spira's whole thing was, sitting down with the opposition, having these dialogues. Mm-hmm. So I think it's kind of multifaceted, the answer to that for activists. You kind of answered also that, one of the ways is sort of talking about it, just kind of raising awareness, talking about this book, get people to read this book so that they know what's going on out there. But for highly motivated activists, where I've seen a lot of advances and you know this because you've been around activists like this who are involved in the pressure campaigns and stuff. There may be possibility to pressure, perhaps universities where you live, kind of adopting this pressure campaign model that's been so successful against the fur industry, the foie gras industry,
Mm.
and kind of, letting even the students on campuses know that maybe they're purchasing beagles from Ridgeland Farms or Marshall, or in the past had been purchasing beagles from Invigo and places like that. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't have the answer, but I think it's kind of informative that you put the question back to me, which is almost like a, a call to action that we need to think about this and kind of not expect everybody to have the answers, and kind of like look within, like, what can we do? Good question. What can I do? And maybe that's the answer, is that we all individually need to think about, okay, I don't know, but what can I do? I don't know. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and when you're talking about Envigo, that made me think of course, the PETA undercover investigation at Envigo that eventually led to that breeding facility being shut down in 2022. And yeah, these undercover investigations are hugely important. I also know that these videos are really hard for people to watch. So I
Mhm.
don't know how much of the general public is watching those. I mean, I could barely watch them. I'd watch a second and then, okay, that's enough.
Yeah.
Um, and when the beagles got out, when there's 4,000 beagles being driven and flown across the country, like that was headlines everywhere around the world.
Right.
But what does it take to kind of break out to a bigger audience? Because if animal activists are continuing to do the protests and I just think that at a certain point some people just shut that off.
Hmm.
They might not be listening. So there's got to be a way to get through that, is not just a video, or it's not just um, protesting or standing outside somebody's house, because, I think that really is upsetting to people.
Hmm. Well, I mean, you've actually been successful at this, getting to a broader audience. I've been really impressed over the past couple of months with just seeing kind of the platforms that you've been able to get on to talk about your book. You're accomplishing something that a lot of animal rights people haven't really accomplished, maybe. And maybe it is because you have your journalist hat on, and maybe they see that they're going to get sort of a nuanced view about this. Um, so that's one thing. That's a kudos to you, by the way. I've been really impressed by that. Also, you brought up
Thank you.
the freeing of the Invigo beagles. I just want to like kind of let people know that uh, you described this because you were there. You were on the scene as these beagles were being driven away, and you had a real front row seat to a lot of this historic stuff, which is extraordinary because all this stuff started to happen, like after you started, compiling the book, and all these advances. Your book just changed over time. So
No, it was
you're.
really amazing. It was like a couple months after I started reporting is when PETA's video came out. And then, yeah, I was just following it in real time. And of course, I had an alert for Beagle, and I was just
Mhm.
like every day I was getting dozens of Beagle alerts and Vigo, and listening to the hearing with the Department of Justice and Envigo. And it was really fortuitous for the book because that ended up getting woven through the whole thing. And then we learned that Hammy's actually, from that facility when it was owned by Covance.
Oh, you
So
you spoiled it, just like you
I
said not.
did.
Yeah, I was thinking, how do I transition into talking about Invigo? But but yeah, that's a really cool thing that you were able to sort of just be there and witness all this stuff and all this. Yeah, it's almost like, I know this is a grim topic. I don't mean to make light of it, but it is, like you said, it was like almost like you picked a hot topic. You kind of like uh were able to like kind of almost foresee that this is, I mean, maybe you didn't, you just started to write this book, but this ended up having all these historic advances all the time while you're writing your book, and so it morphs and change, and you had to stay deft and agile to adapt to the changes that you were going to be writing about, I'm sure.
Well,
Yeah,
I think that that's also just, it shows how quickly things are happening today, that things are really changing, because, that happened while I was writing the book. But as soon as I turned the manuscript in, the NIH and FDA started making announcements, and then Ridgeland is going to be shutting down. And, so things are really changing.
they're
The
changing
CDC
fast.
saying they're not going to be testing on monkeys anymore. So, it'll be interesting to see what happens just in the next year.
You mentioned Ridgeland, and I got like a nice privileged window into kind of maybe something similar to the experience that you had with like that initial meeting with the DC-7, because we were there for the Ridgeland trial when the charges got
Mm.
dropped. And one of the things that was organized during that time in Wisconsin was a march through the city and a gathering of all these beagles. So we got to like kind of hang out for an hour with all these rescued beagles. I'm sure there were some in Vigo beagles there. It was really incredible to like just kind of hang out with the animals and meet them. Uh, and then march with them. I guess some of them may have, I can't remember if the dogs themselves were marching with us. If not, that would have been cool. But yeah, that was really extraordinary to witness. And then I got the privilege to meet Julie, the beagle, who's been sort of made famous because of being one of the prominent dogs rescued from Ridgeland, who spins and spins. And I've met Julie, and she still spins to the right, just a constant spinning. But now she spins out of excitement, and But
Oh, that's awesome. I was heading to that trial. It was on my calendar, and then when it was canceled just before, the 11th hour, I just thought, oh my God, I have so many chapters to write. Should I go and have this like amazing experience in Madison, or should I hunker down and keep writing? And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I chose the
yeah,
latter.
yeah, probably it gave you, it obviously worked out. You were able to, write this book. I also think it's very cool that you have a quote right on the cover from Jane Goodall, just saying "remarkable." That's that's also extraordinary. That's very cool.
Yeah, no, that
Um,
was remarkable that it happened. It was, yeah, really
yeah,
amazing.
kind of going back to Hammy, because we actually haven't talked a ton about Hammy. We talked a little bit about him, but you know, meeting Julie and seeing how she spends, how she still had the effects of this, what was done to her for so long. How did you see Hammy adjust over time? I mean, you obviously had such a fondness for you. You guys were so close. Um, so I guess, you certainly made him feel loved. Like he definitely felt that. But maybe tell me a little bit about how things changed over the years. I know he started to get older, obviously, as all dogs do. But yeah, sorry, I'll shut up. You go ahead.
He became much more comfortable in the house, after the first 6 months, definitely the first year. But when we went to new places, he could still be nervous, and there was something about sounds that would trigger him. So at some point, I mean, years after I'd adopted him, he would hear the ding of an iPhone and he would just start trembling. And I don't even have an iPhone. I don't have a smartphone, but we were around people with iPhones and he heard that ding. It was just like something just got to him and he was shaking and shaking. So I eventually had to ask everyone to silence their phones. But, it's just curious to me because he didn't come into my life with that trigger. And, maybe it reminded him of something else that was in the lab. Maybe it took time for his little brain to process, in his subconscious what that sound was. And then my neighbors have a chain link on their back gate. So, it's nice out and the windows are open. You could hear that chain and that would also make him tremble. And so, I could speculate like what happened in the lab that made him nervous about that, but it clearly was taking him back in some way. Because he'd just be sitting here in the house and that would set him off. So the sounds were problematic his whole life, but we ended up doing a lot of the writing for the book at my friend's house in rural Virginia. And so it was out of the city. It was quiet. he had kind of free reign of the yard, and he would just find his own spot to sit in the grass. And he was so happy. He was, he was never nervous there. He was just really calm and relaxed. And it just felt like such a honor for me to have a decade with him and have all those years and see him healed and see him, who he should have been when he was born.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think it's very telling that the vast majority of the book, interspersed throughout all telling us about the animal testing, was trying to figure out what happened to Hammy. And I think that's very telling that it was such a struggle to find out. You talk to people who may have worked on Hammy, you talk to people who may know where he was, maybe what had happened to him, but it was very unclear, which I think kind of points to the fact that these dogs are not really looked at as individuals at times and are not really accounted for. It's almost like, yeah, what was your, I mean, I was getting frustrated for you throughout this process as you kept tracking down lead after lead, trying to find out just some basic facts about Hammy, who was once called Gator. You found out. I don't know why he had the name Gator, but yeah, you must have felt an immense amount of frustration, I think, throughout this process. And there were probably times when you're like, do I even have a story here? Which you did, by the way. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. But yeah, what was that whole process like for you?
Yeah, incredibly frustrating. At some point I thought, oh, I should just keep a list of all of the, alumni or researchers or former researchers from this school where he was from, and, kind of chart it, and when I'm reaching out to them and when I'm emailing them again. Because at the beginning I just thought, oh, I'm just emailing these people. And then after a while it was like, oh my God, there are so many people, and I hadn't tracked it all. So I never made the chart, but it was infuriating. There were so many leads that I got, and they were just dead ends. And either people wouldn't get back to me, or they would get back to me and say, can't help you on this. And I think that I did learn enough to feel like I had a story and I had some clues that were really helpful. But I think what's frustrating is just how closed the industry is. And this is the industry of testing on animals, whether it's biomedical research or product testing or veterinary education or selling the animals that grade school students use for dissection. It's none of these people want to talk. I shouldn't say none, because I did talk to some researchers, and I'm really grateful for that. But generally, they don't want to talk. And this goes back to when you were talking about the euphemisms and not wanting the information to get out to animal activists. And there's still a real fear. And some of these people have been harassed, or they know somebody who's been harassed, or they've read stories. They want to do their work and go home at the end of the day and hang out with their pet dogs and cats, and then go back into the lab. And I think that this is part of the dialogues that we need to have, is what's actually happening, because in a lot of cases these are our tax dollars. And as voters, we don't like to learn about this stuff. It's like people who are eating meat really don't want to know what happens and where it comes from. So we can either be in the dark about it and all this stuff is still happening, or we can educate ourselves. I'm just talking and talking. I don't even remember what I'm talking about anymore.
Well,
but no, you were you were asking. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Oh, well, I was going to say, it reminded me of what you were saying, reminded me of your chapter about adoption, where you were talking about how I think you noted that there were something like 22 states that have laws currently to require adoption of these lab animals, something like that. But you brought up something, someone's quote or something that made me think a little bit. And they were saying that some of these researchers don't want to adopt out their beagles because they're worried that people are going to become activists and make a big point about animal testing. So something that should be just an obvious kind of no-brainer. Okay, you tested on these beagles, now give them a nice home. Some of them have, recalcitrance to do that because they're worried about fallout, which does, from my view, doesn't say to activists do something different, but maybe think about. Maybe it makes you think a little bit. Yeah.
Right.
What did you think about that quote? That was interesting.
Well, of course, the first thing I think is that, I went off and wrote a book about the dog that got adopted.
Yeah. Right. So everybody do that. Write a book.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I was surprised to learn the really small percentage of dogs that even get out. I think it was Johns Hopkins in that hearing. They said it was 6% of their dogs got adopted out and the rest were euthanized. So, we see these former lab dogs and they are really few and far between compared to the total number we've got. So,
Yeah.
but going back to your earlier point, just about the records, these animals are absolutely commodities. I got some documents that PETA shared from in Vigo, and it was really a packing slip, like you would order, anything else for your lab. And it had the dogs listed, had their tattoo numbers and the color and male, female. And at the end, there's a place for somebody to sign that everything was received. And, that's how these dogs were sold. And, they were, I think at one point, $1,300 each from Envigo. And the universities and other labs would buy them and they would get transported in some way. And then, if they're lucky, they got out of the lab, but usually they didn't, because if there's drug testing or other chemical testing, they need to be euthanized. So their organs and tissues can be looked at and studied and see if there's cancer. And that was just par for the course with these animals. So were not seen as individuals. Dogs, more than probably any other lab animal, sometimes got extra attention. They sometimes did get names. Sometimes they got toys, but that's really not typical.
Yeah, not typical. And then you had, Hammy next to you throughout this whole project. I know this is an impossible question to answer, but we know dogs are very smart. Do you think Hammy had a sense that he was on this sort of mission as well? Because, I mean, you were visiting all these places that, are so relevant to Hammy's life.
Mm-hmm. I certainly like to think that he did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was quite a character throughout this book. And he definitely seemed to have, well, I'll say, he seemed to have a lot of joy throughout his entire life. You've described a lot of scenes in your book where he was excited, running around. In fact, I think there was even a part where you talked about how, like, dogs sometimes just run for joy. And I think your partner mentioned, with humans, we need something. We need a trophy or something to go running or but I love how dogs just, they'll get the zoomies and start running around. Yeah.
Oh, it's so fun to watch that.
It is. There's this little dog that I watch from time to time who gets the zoomies to a point that it's almost concerning, because it's like he's out of control and he's flying around, and we're thinking, are we going to be hiking with him on the mountain? He's going to get zoomies and launch himself. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, it's one thing. And, I have this little row house on Capitol Hill. So, there wasn't a lot of zoomies he could do there. I mean, he'd go up and down the stairs and up and down the stairs over and over again. But, when we were on a beach or, a big grassy yard, and he just had this whole open space, it was just amazing to watch. I mean, it was almost like he was flying with his ears straight out to the side and his, paws forward and back. And it was just really a joy for me.
Not to diverge from what people are going to find interesting, but we share that, actually. I used to live on East Capitol Hill in a row house as well. it was for about a year, while my then girlfriend was working at NIH, actually, which, wow, maybe I should talk to her about all this and see if she has some insight. Because I wasn't vegan at the time. I wasn't an animal rights person. So I wasn't really in that world at that time. But I love that community. Well, something about DC to me, it's like a big city that can at times feel like a small town, like have small town like areas and stuff. Have you been in DC for a long time?
I was actually born in DC,
Oh, okay.
and my dad and grandfather were both born here, and my great grandfather came here from Russia when he was a teenager via Montreal. So my family's been here for a while, and I love Capitol Hill. I mean, it's very green, and I can go for a run around the Capitol, and I can go be on the water with my paddleboard on the Potomac or the Anacostia
Oh,
River,
nice. Yeah,
within
right.
10 minutes. And so it's a good place. And of course, I always like to leave too and go see other places.
Yeah, for sure. You definitely describe as someone who likes to be on the road a lot. Um, where do you think that came from? Was that just a desire to kind of, have, a wandering spirit kind of thing? You just wanted to see other places?
When I get in the car, I always have a notepad next to me because there's something about just leaving my home and my environment that my brain just starts daydreaming and I get ideas. And it's like I can turn everything off. I mean, literally, like leaving everything behind. And I just feel relaxed in the car in a way that I can't in my own house because there's always something to do. And
Mm.
my computer is looking at me and assignments. And also, I think maybe it's in my genes because my dad loves driving long distances.
Hmm.
He's a ham radio engineer, and my
Oh,
whole
cool.
life he's been driving to, they call them ham fests, and ham radio engineers get together and they buy and sell their wares. And from the time I was little, we would drive out to California to see my mom's family, and we drive to Hamfest with him, and he can just get in a car from drive for a long time too. So,
And then you had Hammy.
and then I
Like,
had Hammy.
isn't that wild?
Yeah.
And we should mention that Hammy's named after Alexander Hamilton, and all the
Yes.
DC-7 dogs were named after founding fathers. Interesting. Um, yeah, that was another thing that was very cool about your story, was that you guys sort of became this little community of the dog DC-7
Mm.
rescuers, and you guys became close and shared your experiences with your beagles over time. I remember you talking about George Washington and all the other founding fathers, and you guys were able to kind of keep tabs on what was going on in their lives. Did you gain any insight from your friends over, like, I'm not sure, I can't remember if the beagles all came from the same place, but did they share similar symptoms of things that were happening as they kind of adjusted to a new life?
Yeah, we definitely did share notes on that. And all of us, or most of us, gathered for the first year reunion, and then the second year, and then we didn't have any more big gatherings, but I definitely did stay in touch. And I remember going to outside Buffalo and to see James Madison, who was Maddie, and she was the only girl. And so I was talking to her adopter, Denise, and we were just talking about how the dogs would sometimes like lick the carpet, or, Maddie had this part of her hip that she just kind of licked nonstop. When you talk about like, this behavior that happens when animals are confined. And George Washington, of course, was afraid to go through doors for a really long time. So Gail had to pick him up and carry him through the doorways. And so, I think each dog kind of had some of their own things, but a lot of them were scared and triggered by certain sounds. And I mean, I think it comes down to they're all individuals. They all have their own personalities, just like we do, and they're going to be affected differently by trauma, even if they were in the same place, which I believe they were. But yeah, it was nice having that community. And none of us had ever done this before, so we learned from each other.
Yeah, yeah, you guys were sort of pioneering it, going through this whole process and bouncing ideas off each other. When you talked about being in your car taking notes, made me realize, I'm kind of curious about your process, like your writing process. You described writing in Virginia, in this rural place in Virginia. That was really nice. So when you were on the road, were you sort of just taking notes on things, and then like you'll go back to Virginia and kind of formulate the chapter and that sort of thing? Was that the process?
Yeah, I reported and researched pretty much nonstop for the first year. And then my friends who've written books before kept saying, Melanie, you got to get the book proposal together. And I'm like, oh, I have more research to do. And they're like, of course you do, but you've got to put the proposal together, because the book proposal is like your sales pitch, because you've got to find an agent, and then you can find a publisher, and then if you're actually going to be writing a book that's going to get published. So at some point I really just had to stop the research and sit down and write. And the book proposal included a couple sample chapters and, long sections about who the audience would be and how I was going to market the book, and what other competing titles are already out there. And then once that was done, and I did have a contract, then I went back to reporting. And I guess the last year and a half or so was mostly writing, but I was also constantly following up with people and getting updates and being like, oh, I still don't really understand this. I think, the very 11th hour, I'm like, there was some FDA thing that I still could not get my head around.
Yeah.
So I was going back to my sources, really until publication.
Yeah. And, I'm sure there's like this feeling, I'm just guessing, when you get the you get it published, I'm sure there's like a huge weight, but then like very quickly you realize, oh crap, there's like this whole other aspect to promote the book and get out and do all these interviews. So like the job's still not done. But it must feel rewarding, I'm guessing, to have the book finally out there and published. And what sort of feedback are you getting from people? And are you happy about the response that you've gotten to the book so far?
Yeah, you're right. It's absolutely amazing to see it out, because you're kind of just in a hole for years and working, just by yourself. And now it's like out for the world to see, which is great, because I've dreamed of this for a really long time. And it's also just a huge switch for me, because I would always say, like, I'm a writer, I'm not a speaker. And when you've got a book out, you have to talk about it. And I was really nervous about that. And, I think a few people just said, look, more about this topic than anyone, and you're the expert. And, I still have a hard time saying that I'm an expert, but I'm getting more comfortable talking, and I'm realizing like these are just conversations. And this is what I've been doing for, what I did for Hammy's whole life. And I'm just talking about it. So it's been really fun. It's been fun to talk to different types of people. I mean, honestly, like, I would love for this book to be part of the dialogue that's happening. I'd love for lawmakers to be reading it. I'd love for Jay Bhattacharya to be reading it, the head of the NIH. And, I think that it could have really broad appeal, because it does touch on so many of these issues, and, it approaches it in a different way. And so, the feedback has really, really been terrific. I'm hearing from a lot of people and doing some fun book events, and so it's all good.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I really hope like people in power read this, and it's not just animal activists reading it. I hope like dog lovers pick up the book. And certainly with some of the sort of mainstream outlets that you've been able to speak with and talk to, certainly it's going to be reaching some people outside of the little bubble of animal activists that is so hard to break out of. So I'm really, really grateful for that. So congratulations. Yeah.
Thank you. I will say I did a talk for the Pro Animal Meetup here in DC, and it was this great group of activists. It was a really fun event. Max Broad did a nice conversation with me, and they had some great questions, and ones that really stumped me. So I'll just tell you what they were asking, because it's just something that we need to be thinking about. One person said, well, what if we stop using dogs, but that all gets moved to pigs? And what if we stop using dogs, but it gets moved to China? And I was like, oh, because
Mhm.
of course these things happen, right? In med schools, the universities did stop using dogs and they switched to pigs. And it took a long time. And PCRM worked really hard on this to get to the point where all North American medical schools are not using live animals anymore.
Mhm.
And we don't know what's happening in China. So, these are real concerns. Nobody wants, the dog numbers here to go down and them to go up in another country.
Right.
And, I didn't do a lot of international research on this. Looking at what's happening globally would have taken me another decade, I think.
Mhm.
But these are real issues.
Well, and I think like the good thing about, when it's in the conversation is that we are bit by bit attacking the root core of the problem, which is the speciesism of using
Mhm.
animals to begin with. Um, so actually how I would have answered that question to that activist is that that can certainly happen, but we're still, making a dent. Like the concern, like let's say like we're having a lot of success with all these foie gras campaigns, right? Well, what if they take foie gras off the menu and just switch it to a different animal product and then more of those
Mm.
animals are suffering? But um, the idea is people are starting to think more, we're saving these animals, and people are starting to think, well, it's pretty easy to go from like, well, if we're not doing this to dogs, then why are we doing this to pigs? I'm not sure. I mean,
Mhm.
that's just my initial take on it. But yeah, it's
Yeah,
kind of
and
like,
certainly, if we are earmarking more of the money to go to the alternatives, the money's got to go somewhere. Right now, billions of dollars are still going toward animal research, and it's millions on the alternative side. So,
mhm,
if you're putting a lot more money in those, there's going to be more development. Period.
mhm. Um, well, just real quickly, and I don't want to take too much of your time, but you mentioned the like, what if it goes to China? What if it goes to, and
Mm.
since you're American and you did a lot of road tripping around America, a lot of this is focused on America. Did you learn much about like sort of the international side of this story, like how animals are being used worldwide, or was it, mainly it's American?
My understanding is that the U.S. is the largest user of animal in labs. Although we don't know about China. So I think that's right, that the US is certainly funding. Um, and I didn't dig into some of these other countries, but I do know, it gets complicated even with cosmetics, where we mostly have kind of conquered that and we're not testing cosmetics on animals here. But what if another country requires it and the parent company is like, well, we have to do it because Brazil requires it? That's just an example, or China requires it. So there are, organizations working kind of on moving this forward globally, and I have faith that those will keep moving forward.
Yeah, and someone who's visited these places like the Organ on a Chip, like we talked about Vanda and Emulate, all these really cool things. Um, what do they need? Like, what do they? Is it just funding that they need? Just the influx of funding? Do they need the government to step in? Do they need new regulations? Well, what are the people that you spoke with saying? This is what we really need to kind of launch this into the stratosphere and take off.
Yeah, I think we need new regulations. We need new funding for the development, so we have more options. So we have, more things that we can test the drugs on. But like I said earlier, at the end of the day, if the government is still requiring that we do 90-day dog tests for every pesticide, which they are, then the companies have to do that. It doesn't matter what alternatives they have. And the government also has to make sure its regulators understand all these new technologies because they're used to getting animal data. They know how to read it, they know how to analyze it. They might not be as familiar with the other methods. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think it's going to take a change at the government level and a lot more funding.
Well, and I know that just one thing that animal activists and my listeners can do is get this book. Another thing that helps out is, review the book on Amazon or whatever you purchase it from. That helps out to, hopefully, like you said, maybe get in the hands of someone who can really make a change. I'm always like just fantasizing that maybe just someone in power will get you get their hands on this book and read it and be like, oh yeah, maybe we ought not do this to dogs or any animals. So I would highly encourage, this is a remarkable book, as Jane Goodall said. Take it from Jane Goodall. It's remarkable. It's fantastic. You will learn a ton from this book. It was almost like, the way that I approached this interview, I had to just take photos of different pages of your book. So when I got started here, I just kind of went through the photos and wrote little notes because there was so much that I learned from this book. So highly encourage people to read this. Melanie, I know you're a busy person, so I'm going to let you go, but is there anything, any final thoughts before I let you go?
I think we covered a lot. I do want to go back to what you said earlier about just, being an activist and being a journalist, because I think what you said is right. I mean, I think as a journalist, it definitely doesn't mean you don't care. And when you know enough about a topic to care, it makes you, it does make you better, because you're going to dig more and you're going to want to find answers. And we're still humans. And so, whether we're covering a war or covering animal research, it's like we have feelings and we've got opinions. And, I think that's all helpful. I mean, otherwise, we're just going to be using AI if that's not playing a role. So, I think that having those feelings, I don't think that made me necessarily have to pick one side or the other. It just, I just went into it knowing that I had to be open to listening. And if we all can do more of that, I think we'll be in a better place.
Yeah. And I think that was a very effective tactic with your journalism, because it did tell the whole story. And yeah, I think I agree with you. It just kind of makes you more committed to getting the truth out there. And what we really want is the truth. And I think most people are of the opinion that dogs are lovely and should not be suffering. And so that's a pretty easy conclusion to get to from learning the truth about what happens to these dogs. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it there. But Melanie, thank you so much. It's so lovely to chat with you. You're always welcome back to my program anytime you want, if you want to do some more promotion of future projects, that sort of thing. Small channel, but what can you do? Hopefully
Well,
next time will be bigger.
then the next time we talk, I want to hear about your living on Capitol Hill and becoming vegan and becoming an activist. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. You start your podcast next.
Okay.
All right.
Jeremy, thank you so much. This has really been wonderful.
You as well, Melanie. Appreciate you. And everybody, go get that book. That's a call to action now. I'll be monitoring all of you. All right. Bye,
Thanks.
Melanie.
Bye.